Hello, friends, and welcome to the Games UX podcast.
A show that explores the world of user experience research in video games. My name is Lennart Nacker, and together with my co-hosts Anders Drachen and Pejman Mirza Babai, we edited the book on games user research. This podcast covers pretty much everything we couldn't fit into the book. Find out more about us on gerbook.com or grab the book from Oxford University Press.
Hey folks, just a quick word of advice. The Games User Research Book podcast is now the Games UX podcast. Same quality, same format, just a new name. Not always all three of us there, sometimes just one of us at a time, but we hope to provide the best content on Games UX just for you. Thanks for tuning in.
I've recently been involved in a lot of work, fundamentally trying to advise policymakers on what to do with games, and it's something that I've been spending quite a lot of the past 2 years doing. Right now, all of this, there is a lot of games are a politically hot topic right now worldwide. And it kind of makes sense that this is happening because games are played by about 4 billion people worldwide, and we spend more than 1 trillion hours doing it, meaning that on average, every person on Earth uses about 30 minutes every day to play games. So the playing of digital games or video games, whatever we choose to call them, has become this sort of mainline human activity that supports like a $220 billion global industry also, right? So it's a large part of our lives now. And obviously, politicians want some sort of control, or at least want to make sure that any negative impacts of this activity are not hitting especially children and young people. So games are sort of have become this really, really hot topic in politics. And a lot of countries, including China and Belgium and others, have already tried to enact various types of policies that essentially have the intent of trying to boost the positive aspects of playing games while sort of curbing or reducing any negative impact. And all of this ties into the larger debate about children and screen time. Interestingly enough, no one is saying that adults with normal office jobs like us sitting in front of a computer screen 20 hours every day is a problem. But the children, think of the children, Lennart. Anyway, but one problem that I have consistently run up against when I try to advise policymakers about what kind of policy to enact in this space is that I find myself stumped. I'm like, they ask me, okay, so how many hours per week is a problem? Like if you play more than X hours, you have a game addiction problem. Or if a child plays more than this many hours or plays these particular games or something, negatively impacts their well-being. And I'm looking at this saying, okay, first of all, I don't have that data. Like the evidence base for guiding policymakers in terms of like what kind of legislation to enact in games in order to create a positive impact, right, doesn't exist. Because we fundamentally don't really know like how many games are being played, where are they being played, how they're being played, how do different types of games impact different types of people. And it's human behavior, right? Like human behavior is incredibly difficult to actually work with. So we're in a situation where we have this hugely complex societal phenomenon, which games is, right? Which is very, very individual, but we need to enact policy. But policy cannot handle that complexity, right?
Well,
so I was wondering, like, what do we do? Like us as academics, as university researchers, we're supposed to provide the information that society needs here, right? But I constantly find myself running my head up against the wall because the information just doesn't exist. Is this something that you're encountering also?
I mean, I have not advised policymakers. I've not had these kind of engagements. I usually, the engagements I have are with companies. And I do think if I was working with, if there was a collaboration with policymakers somewhere, there would have to be this idea that if you're doing it with scientific research, it really has to be rooted in scientific research, right? So understanding the nuanced effects that you can have on gameplay, on the different age groups, or that the gameplay that you create has on different age groups, on cultural context, on mental health conditions. There are some studies in that regard, but there's not enough. And specifically, what we would need, and we've needed for years, are longitudinal studies to trace these long-term effects. And those are really hard to do, as you know, because we are lacking the kind of funding. And even if you look at the cycle of, how long it takes to do a PhD, it is really difficult to create these studies that run over 10, 15 years and actually provide these results that would be needed to inform policy. A lot of the research is short impact studies, and a lot of it is good and a lot of it is useful, but it is not providing the corroboration that you would want. Ideally, you'd want some sort of larger agency within which this can be conducted, right? Like you have that for food and health and these types of things that, larger agencies and larger funding bodies can make sure to finance this type of long-term research. Universities and the places where we do the research generally do not provide that funding. They do not provide that kind of support. So it is quite interesting to think about, how can this be done, and what can we do as individual researchers? Probably not so much unless we get the support from an institute or something larger. I mean, what we can do currently is we can look at the evidence that is being collected in the literature that, claims negative or positive effects on well-being, looking at things like addiction and monetization methods and things like that. And to kind of see how that impacts us, as a brief primer on that. One of my students, we're currently working on, top secret, Kai paper on deceptive design in a video game, a specific video game. And looking at these deceptive design patterns that are being used to trick people in free-to-play games. This is a particular free-to-play game. And we're looking at consumer feedback, right? Like looking at what's the consumer feedback with the game, and what can we learn from this sort of broad player base that is actively criticizing this business model transition that we see that a lot of game developers are thinking about. And there's nobody to blame. It's not a bad idea to transition from I pay for the entire game towards I pay to play, whereas pretty much there are incentives in the game that I then pay for that then influence the game mechanics. But those can be pretty tricky, and the more you try to trick your user, the less you use the trust of the user base. So it's a very delicate balance as a game designer when you're creating these games, to not trick the people that are playing your games into behavior that they actually do not enjoy, which then only benefits grinding, compulsive behaviors, and other things that they actually just end up paying for, or pretty much they're left with that choice of I am either going to engage in this compulsive behavior or I pay to get out of it. And that would not be a good situation. But some games are experimenting with that. I'm going to be benevolent and say it's an experiment. One could also say it's, a bit of a negative intention here, but I think it's an experimentation. They just see, okay, is this something where we can make money? Because at the end of the day, they have a product, they need to make money with it. But I think that's where it becomes interesting to think about ethical issues on the developer side. And also as a UX researcher, is it your responsibility to put down your foot on that ethical side and say, listen, I have the power of investigating what this impact is and how compulsive your new game mechanic is. And I'm telling you this, but I'm also telling you this is not a good idea in the long term, because there's plenty of studies that show if you make people do something, it will result in societal effects that are beyond just making money. I mean, I'm going to stop soon and let you speak, but like one of the things that comes to mind is you might have seen them. There's a ton of documentaries touched TV shows on the opioid epidemic / on OxyContin on Netflix and on Amazon Prime and these things. One was called Dope Sick. The other one is called Painkiller. I don't know if you've seen those on your TVs. And I mean, here you're pretty much breaking down a company that literally just builds a drug that is kind of heroin, pretty much just like encapsulated in a pill, and working with the health system to make it look harmless. And then now or years later has to face with the outcome that a lot of people just ended up, having their lives ruined by this wonder drug that was pitched, right? And so I'm not saying games are a drug or anything like that, but I do think there is something, I know it's a pretty tricky slope here. Be careful what you're saying. But I am saying, there's a similar responsibility, right? Like if you're building something that's highly engaging, that can be highly compelling for somebody, you have to think about ethical implications. And sure, games do not have that same power, but it is something to think about. And over to you before I talk myself into a corner.
No, because like all of this is really all of this is incredibly interesting, and also points to a fundamental gap I feel like we have in games research right now, and it's very interesting that you are mentioning sort of government agencies, where you are completely right. I mean, it is long running government agencies. They have the power to run the kinds of sort of 10-15 year longitudinal studies that would be like nigh on impossible to run in an academic environment, given how academic funding works right now. It's possible we could do it. We could do it in medical research, where long-term studies are still a thing. But for example, I would be hard pressed finding any kind of funding source that could support technical research in games for a period of longer than maybe 3 years, right? So you were right. I think it would be really interesting exploring whether there is some sort of another agency or think tank or something like or an institute, like something that needs something that we need to supplement the academic world here. You also talk about that we have lots of evidence, sort of spot based evidence from sort of smaller studies that shows situations where games are having a negative impact. And we know that from people who work with addiction foundations and addiction clinics and so that game addiction is a real problem, right? People and also on the other hand, like people gaming away all their money on skin betting and microtransactions is an actual real thing, right? What we don't know is how widespread is this problem, like how big of a problem is it, right? Because we lack those large scale longitudinal studies, ideally running across multiple countries, like we would see in gambling research or in general addiction research, right? We simply don't have that information, and that makes creating policy in the gaming space and I'm talking about policy here, which is fair and positive and constructive, both towards the players and the industry and everyone else involved, right? That is missing. We've recently within the digital observatory, we've recently been doing some sort of ultra large scale studies using data from Unity, where for the first time we can actually start looking at like global playtime distributions, global monetization distributions, and that kind of stuff. But it is very much the very, very first step. And currently, while our results are very interesting, for example, in showing the lack of impact on a couple of policies in China intended to sort of curb playtime, which then apparently hasn't had the desired impact, at least in the sample games that we are looking at. It doesn't really tell us, all right, fine, that didn't work. What do we do now, right? At the same time, and then it's probably my turn to sort of shut up here, and so we can move on, right? Is the evidence base we have for talking about both the negative and the positive impact of games is very much based on small-scale studies that are very, very hard to generalize. Am I right here, or what do you think?
I think you're right. We don't have a lot of longitudinal studies. I do think, though, and we have to be honest about that, it is the same as, positive and negative. Like, we have an equal amount of studies. There's no conclusive evidence to one side or the other. There are techniques. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do these potential negative impacts that you see there compare to those that we see in other forms of media, television, movies, other forms of media, social media. And you mentioned screen time at the beginning, right? Like, how much of that is the novelty effect, the engagement effect of these new technologies that can be very compelling and draw us into these worlds. So obviously neither of us wants to demonize games. We love games. We love the positive outcomes of games. There's so many positive well-being ideas that come from games that can help foster healthy behaviors as well. But I also think either side needs stronger evidence, needs longer studies. And I think there is a nuance that is in interaction that you can't find in consumption media like television and movies, where you're simply just consuming, and here you're interacting. So it becomes about the nature of interaction. So naturally, there is a bigger responsibility, I would say, for somebody designing an interaction, because an interaction is very much about learning. It's about behavior. And I mean, we do know about powerful things that can foster behavior change, that can improve behavior. There is a myriad of studies about how games can really help you deal better with things, games that help you through depression and other things. And it can be done through the power of combining narrative and combining interaction design and interaction mechanics. But there's also, of course, the risk that something that is highly interactive and highly a medium highly for learning and really learning about things, and learning means there's a cognitive process involved. There is also, of course, the risk, and that can't be forgotten about, the risk that you could also learn something that, or be conditioned into something that's not so good, right? Like, and of course, it's a fine line. It's like, yes, there's an ethical responsibility on the designers, on the companies, on, the whole chain upwards, but there is also a responsibility about educating the consumers about, responsible gaming and things like that as well, right? Like, it should not, like and I'd love to hear your side of this, but like, it should obviously not all be on the consumer and say, you just figure it out. We just give it to you and you just figure out what's good and what's bad. But when we talk about policymakers and governing bodies, we've had in the past, we've had these rating systems with like ages, just similar to movies, which I don't think is like 100% effective, because really there are, there are degrees of interaction, and some of these can be compelling to a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, whatever. And I think a rating along the lines of, okay, this is, how compelling this thing is, would be much more useful than, okay, this is something that we're just rating the content, right? Like, we're just rating, okay, there's violence in there, so probably don't show it to your children. I mean, that's just common sense at this point. But like, what about the things where it's like, oh, we've kind of added a little, gambling mechanic inside of this otherwise great game that is actually very, very compelling and will really, these random intermittent rewards will really make you kind of engage with this particular part. And there's a risk also that you might be purchasing a lot of things because you're kind of getting really into it.
So
thoughts?
Sorry?
Your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I think you're onto something really, really interesting here. I mean, putting aside the fact that we right now know very little um, uh, about how games generate positive or negative impacts in a systematic manner, right? It's a large scale, solid evidence manner. We have lots of anecdotal evidence, we have lots of small scale studies, but again, how do we tie it all together, right? If you put that aside for the minute and sort of think about sort of more practically what could be done right now. Now we know that one of the big challenges that we're dealing with here in practice is the gap between children and parents, right? Where a lot of parents, they don't have the knowledge and they don't have the resources to really understand games or what the children are doing in and with games, whether it's positive or negative, right? Like there's a generational gap in the understanding. As a parent myself, I feel that, right? And I'm supposedly a professor in computer science with an actual understanding of computers. Yet I'm a freaking dinosaur, right? Just ask my students. So there is, I think, a lot of what we are trying to do, for example, with ESRB ratings, are coming from a different time. So where maybe, like for example, with the game ratings, ultimately they are based on film and television, right? How much violence and how much sexual content, how much nudity, blah blah blah, right? But you're right, games are interactive experiences. They are different. And let's not even get started on virtual reality applications and the rise of the metaverse and all that kind of jazz, which again changes things completely, right? So having a different type of rating system would definitely help parents, because again we have to get over this idea that all parents are resource strong, because there are a lot of parents out there that are not resource strong, and they need help in bridging that gap in understanding, right? So what I have seen both in the UK and the US and in European countries like Denmark are attempts to create websites or services with information for parents. But invariably, I see them getting very complex. Like, for example, your child plays Dota. All right, fine. Here are, half an hour's worth of reading about Dota and mechanics and whatnot, right? Which again does not match the need that parents have. And just to be clear, we don't even know what the needs of parents are, right? We haven't even done that research either, again, in a systematic scale, blah, 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 right? So I think you're right. I think we need a different way of classifying games, maybe, of putting them into buckets and describing them in a way that's more meaningfully actionable from the perspective of well-being. That was a long monologue.
Yeah, no, that was good.
That one.
It's a tricky question, right? Like, and obviously we don't want to get stuck too much in that, but I do think these are issues to think about, and really it's it's so many different parties involved. It's like, you can't say it's just politics, you can't say it's just designers and developers, and you can't say it's just parents. You can also not just say it's just the user, it's just the consumer, right? Like all of the people have to work together. And I think the really interesting takeaway here is that no product that you create, and this goes beyond games, this goes really for any product that you create, exists in a vacuum, right? Like you always have to think about the impact of your product that goes beyond just the normal enjoyment of it or the normal consumption or the normal use of it. Like how does it affect society in a broader scale? And a lot of times we don't think about that. We're caught up in the moment, we're caught up in the development process, we're caught up in building a feature, and a lot of development teams don't have sort of this person that has the larger view of how does this tie into the fabric of society, because let's be fair here. Like, it's not really reasonable for a studio to think about that. But I think larger term, in terms of strategy of who you want to be as a development studio, and like where you want to, how do you want to position yourself? What's your brand, right? Like these kind of things. I think there are people that think about that, but I think the thinking is really more limited towards regular marketing aspects and things that are just related to the immediate repercussions of something. It's not so much, I don't think it's so much in the direction of, okay, here is a real impact societal, estimate that we have with this. Let's be responsible about this. I mean, you could blame, you couldn't blame consumerism and a capitalist society, capitalism. You could just say it's just the society that we're embedded in, right? Like this, you make a lot of money, it enables you to do a lot of nicer things with your life than if you don't make a lot of money. So in theory, you could put the blame there, but I think that's too simplistic. I think it's more um, everyone, part of being an adult, part of being an adult worker and in an adult workforce is to bring that responsibility with yourself and think about how you function as part of a system. Because again, no human is an island. Everyone is kind of networked and connected. So to see this fabric that you're in, I think is important. And often we don't see it. We're very self-focused apes, essentially, right? Like we're just like doing the stuff that works for us. But I think sometimes we have to take a step back and kind of see how we fit into that larger fabric of things. And it's tough to do. I'm not saying, it's easy. I certainly struggle with that at times. And, you get very focused on the thing that you do and produces good outcomes. Like reminding yourself to take that step back and see sort of the bigger picture is tough. Yeah.
And perhaps also like a consistent problem that we're struggling with in academia, and there are similar types struggles on industry side. Is also the incentive structures, right? In academia, we are incentivized to get as much external funding as possible, to write as many papers as possible, get as many citations to those papers as possible. In industry, obviously, there is a drive to generate generate revenue, right? And those incentives drive behavior. And there are preciously few hard-hitting incentives towards taking that step back, as you say. I find that both in academia and in industry, there are people who think a lot about these issues. In fact, I find that, what you would put it, that thinking about the role of games in society is something that has gone a real renaissance in the industry, at least among the colleagues that I speak with. But translating that into like a real meaningful change can be extremely difficult, because you're up against those the incentive structures, right? Just like in academia, like we all know what kind of research that we could be doing towards really generating truckloads of positive societal impact, but the incentive structures go against it, right?
Yeah.
That I don't think, as you correctly say, I think it's an excuse, and I think the world demands that we start finding ways through these sometimes very counter through these structures in society, in the way we work, in the way how everything works, which is preventing us from generating the kind of positive societal impact
it's
that
counterintuitive.
everyone I know in games want to generate, right?
Yeah, I think we hit some really hard questions there. We kind of went away from our well-being more like towards societal impact here, which is fine. I think for today's episode, I think this was a nice deep dive into some of these larger impacts, because well-being is of course attached to how you function in the fabric of those around you, and how you find that equilibrium for yourself. So I think this was a really nice, interesting, in-depth discussion that we've had here. And do we have any closing words for today's episode? I think maybe one of the things I wanted to mention is, if you're watching this episode, if you're on our YouTube channel, if you're not, find our YouTube channel, subscribe. If you're on your favorite podcast app, we really appreciate you leaving a review there. Really helps visibility of the podcast. If you leave us a review and give us some feedback. We also appreciate you just reaching out to us on gerbook.com and sending us your feedback and maybe potential questions for a future episode. We'd love to hear from you. We just wanted to say, overall, we're really trying to understand the industry as a whole. We're trying to understand the process of game UX within the larger fabric of game development and video game studios and everything that comes with it. And hopefully this was somewhat interesting to you and gave you some, pointers for thinking in certain directions that maybe help you understand this a little bit better.
Right on.
All right. See you next time.
This was another episode of the Games UX podcast.
Thank you for tuning in. Check out the Games User Research book with a blue cover, published by Oxford University Press, the only research-backed book out there that provides an authoritative overview of UX research in games. Reading it will accelerate your growth as a game UX researcher so that you can achieve better results faster. Thank you to everyone leaving those 5-star ratings for the book on Amazon. Hey, even if you're not a games user researcher, our book will provide an instant opportunity for you to get an overview of UX in games. Check out Games User Research on Amazon.com. Send us your feedback anytime to editors@gerbook.com, and see you in our next episode.